of media could be pictured as 45–50% as entertainment. It's scandals, sport, speaking about celebrities' life, and all that kind of stuff. So it's not quite about issues of public concern. 35% movies and TV serials, and about 20% are news. And you still have to bear in mind that all agenda is really controlled by the state. So all of federal media is basically sending one and the same message, but just pronounced by different heads. And if we talk about the public media, and I've heard discussion about public media in Poland, officially we do have a public TV station, but it's not popular at all. It's not really providing like a key agenda for audience, and it's not fully public if we take a concept of public media, public broadcasting media, as it is accepted in Europe. Because editor-in-chief of Russian public TV is actually appointed by the president of the Russian Federation. So therefore, the majority of discussion on matters of public concern is shifted to internet, and thank God we still have access to internet, because there is a lot of discussion going on to control internet, not just by putting and introducing more and more restrictions, but also by closing Russian internet within the borders of the country, like China did a while ago. So Russian democratically thinking audience is mainly discussing things on internet and in social media, but we still fear threats from Russian media regulator to block Facebook and YouTube, and we don't really afraid of closure of federal TV channels, because there are two different audiences, and the audience that really cares about matters of public concern, about democratic development of the country, we don't watch TV. I haven't watched TV for like 10 years. Even though I work with media, I'm a media lawyer, I just can't tolerate what is being said on TV. So basically, there are two different populations in the country. The one that absorbs information from TV, mainly, and from state media, and they have a totally different picture of what is going on in the country, rather than from the other part of population that gets information from internet. So second issue that I would like to point your attention to is lack of justice and climate of impunity, that also makes a lot of difference when it comes to the freedom of speech and freedom of expression and media freedom in the country. Unfortunately, impunity leads to the situation when journalists restrain themselves from disseminating information on matters of public concern, and media become absorbed in self-censorship, and thus essential and vital information is hardly available via traditional media. And a huge level of propaganda is all over the federal broadcast media, which really poisons society. And unfortunately, physical violence, harassment, intimidation, and cases of detention of journalists, and the failure to solve cases of murder of journalists, as well as restrictive media policy, continue to undermine the exercise of freedom of expression and freedom of information. And you might know that attacks on journalists in Russia never stopped, and it's a regular method to silence criticism. So for the last 10 years, over 260 journalists have been killed in Russia, and only 42 cases were brought to the court. So this climate of impunity creates a very high level of censorship. And here is one of the examples of a very well-known Russian journalist, Oleg Kashin, who was harshly beaten up in front of his Moscow apartment building, was in an induced coma for a while, and perpetrators haven't been brought to justice. They haven't been even found for over eight years. And lack of proper investigation by the state create climate of impunity and self-censorship, and it raises self-censorship among journalists and bloggers, journalists mainly, which together with the financial and administrative pressure and control over media demotivate journalists from fulfilling their traditional role of being watchdog of democratic society. So those are the risks that media faces every day, and state control, which is really tough, is raising these problems on a daily basis. Another issue that influences a lot on media and is directly linked with state control over content and media working in reporting on what is going on in the country is matters how protests in the country and political process is covered. So basically, since late 2011, from the parliamentary elections, the protests are happening on a regular basis, and they are being pressured and stopped by the government. And we face a lot of problems with arresting reporters trying to report on protests all around the country. So basically, following actions of protest showed that authorities cannot tolerate free speech and criticism with regards to elections and political situation in the country. But from the positive point of view, I have to say that when reporters can't fulfill their mission, activists and just regular people who use iPhones, Androids, and all other devices, they just make direct stream broadcasting, and they replace with their reporting journalists who are being pressured or unable to report on a platform of official media. And protests are almost never shown on federal TV, so that part of society, that part of population which gets information from TV, they don't show this. They don't see that. They don't see protests happening in the country. They totally live in a different reality. They see everything in a positive way. They see that how wonderful the policy of Russian government is, and all the victories of Russia outside the country, and everything what is going on, and all issues which are being raised during the actions of protests. They don't reach a very big chunk of population that uses TV and official radio as sources of information. So that's two realities, two different parts of population, and I would say that the one that gets information from official traditional media and broadcast media mainly, it's about 60% more or less. And just one example. When action of protest is happening, activists and participants of these rallies, they have been arrested together with journalists reporting about these actions. And lately, reporters are not even let on a spot. So police identifies who's reporter, and they put them in a police truck and keep them there, or just drive them away from the place where the rally is going on, so they don't see what is getting, so they can't report. So societies only can get that from very sporadic information that participants are posting on their social media. So that's this is an example from 2014, when on one particular rally, over 430 participants, including journalists, have been arrested. And the last point, which really is one of the main matters of concern among journalists and active part of population and lawyers who are working on freedom of expression and human rights, is restriction, restricting approach of state over internet. A positive thing is that percentage of population using internet is growing fast. So people are getting online they mainly get information online. A lot of part of population, young population, youth, is mainly getting information online from social media. They use more Facebook, other social media, YouTube, and that is good because they have some alternative view on what is some independent view, some variety of views, comparing to what they could hear if they would watch TV. And so blogs, social media, role of new methods of broadcast and disseminate information is growing, which is great. So that gives us hope that even in a very restrictive environment in which Russian media works at the meantime, we still have some access to information. Well, of course, until internet is locked within the borders of Russian Federation, which I myself hope that will never happen. But you never know. Government is constantly introducing new methods of control over internet, and it's getting not even funny because it's not only varieties of different lists, blacklists of websites with all sorts of information. It's also judicial and extrajudicial way to block different kinds of information. And at the meantime, one of those cases is being considered by the European Court, which promises to be a pilot case. Our lawyers are working on this case as well. So we see how the European Court will put their position on blocking of internet in Russia. And I hope that this also will influence different other regions around the Europe. So another problem, and it's a real problem which we don't see how to overcome this yet. It's a personal data localization law, which in 2 words means that if any website or online service collects information, private personal data of users in their server, Russian government wants them to identify, separate Russian users from all other users and keep their personal data within the data centers, data storage centers within the Russian Federation. So they say that it's not safe to keep Russian citizens' personal data outside Russia because they could be abused by some other governments, let's say. So they require Facebook, YouTube, Booking.com, Amazon, all social networks to somehow separate Russian users and put all their personal data somewhere in Russia. And of course, services don't want that. Sometimes they can't do this because it's difficult to fulfill this requirement. So thus, because of lack, due to failure to meet this requirement, LinkedIn social media was blocked in Russia, and we unfortunately face similar approach towards Facebook, which would be catastrophe because Facebook is mainly the main platform for free exchange of opinions and for coordination of protests and some kind of social activity in Russia. Massive control over social media. And government understands that social media plays a totally different role in Russia. It's not like just a place to exchange information about cat pictures, families, pictures, and some kind of entertainment content. It's more like a political instrument. People are using their social media pages to exchange, to connect, to unite, to exchange information, and that is getting more and more dangerous from the point of view of the government. So they try to control that. So lately, government introduced quite a number of different laws trying to block information published by individuals and put pressure on administration of social media, even if they are not Russian. So in conclusion, I would say that from a positive point of view, I think that it's, again, difficult to talk about positive trends if you're working with the freedom of expression in Russia, but still, internet gives us hope, and I think that when journalists are being prevented or restricted from exercise their freedom of expression, freedom of information, to fulfill their role as a watchdog in a democratic society. As long as we have internet and access to different platforms to exchange our information and opinion, active internet users can replace professional journalists or work with them together to overcome this control over media, information, and internet, which is constantly introduced by the government. So that's basically what I wanted to say, and I would be happy to answer any questions if there will be any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Galina Arapova. I will now invite Thomas Wroblewski to introduce the panel and ask the panel to move up to. There will be huge possibilities to ask questions. It's up to the moderator. Would you have the questions now?
We can do it through the panel after or during.
Yeah. So we will remember you, and so you have your question.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Galina. It was very good and obviously depressing. And I would say whole morning was quite depressing. And we listened about all this media and catastrophe that comes out. Some of them are serious, some of them to be discussed. Sometimes we talked about those politicians who want to obliterate media. We talk about internet. They have the algorithms that doesn't help us publishing their thoughts. We talk about companies that required some, we heard today, some input in return for advertising. And it's all the sad stories, and some of them are real and sometimes probably a little presumptuous and mystified, like in case of Poland, but still, this is something to be discussed, and I hope this panel would help us to put some light into this dark dungeon of media. Maybe we'll talk about solutions. I don't know whether the state is a solution, and myself, I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm working for Freedom Enterprise Foundation, so the state, it's something we also strive against. And our panels are people who deal a lot with media, private and public, and supporting media, and all the people who are trying to work for better and free media. And we'll try to talk about solutions. What are the solutions, first of all, for state control and over-control and interference? Maybe we'll start our discussion with Gulnara Akutova, Head of Department of Global Response and International Media Support, about solutions.
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, it's been a very, very smart move that you've decided to start with me, because I couldn't wait to speak, to raise my hand, to tell you that I do have a solution.
Fantastic.
I do have a solution. And I think the solution is that we have brave individuals like Galina, like our Turkish colleague, who came here and who spoke about all those violations. Despite all the risk they face back home, they came here, they provided information, they were able to collect and analyze the information. And that's the solution for us, to invest into those people. Because very often, I live in Denmark, and then I represent International Media Support, which is a media development organization working across 4 continents in 25 countries of the world, including Turkey and Russia. And I know by my experience is that what we can do, we should support people on the ground, because change comes from inside. Change will never come from outside. It's not Council of Europe, it's not EU, it's not IMS, it's not media development organizations who can change the situation. These are journalists. NGOs, activists, academia, who are inside the country, and then only they can change the situation. We speak about Turkey, and we speak about huge number of journalists jailed, harassed, prosecuted, murdered. But we don't speak about excellent media outlets that still exist in Turkey, and I can name them. I can show you the website. They do exist, who provide robust, professional, ethic-based journalism, which informs the public debate in Turkey. I can name it. It's, for example, this is Diken. And my Turkish colleague who is here, she can confirm that that's a very independent, very professional media outlet. She mentioned fact-checking. She mentioned TEIT. And TEIT is a very groundbreaking initiative. They are also on the board of Poynter, worldwide fact-checking platform, Poynter. They are very experienced, and we should learn from these people how to do fact-checking in our countries, how to do fact-checking in Denmark, how to do fact-checking in the West. So we should praise these people, and we should discuss ways to support these people. What can be done in Russia? What can be done in Turkey in order to promote freedom of expression and secure good journalism? Because good journalism is the best answer to propaganda, to censorship, to everything. So there is a need to boost and support good journalism. Thank you. Can I continue?
Well, yeah, we'll go back to it. But thank you so much. It was very moving. And I would also, well, it's exactly the point I want to touch. I mean, it's not like a journalist was discovered last year or last 5 years. We were also in 19th centuries and in 20s and during Nazis and communism, and we survived. And the question was, maybe we are a little spoiled. Maybe we get used to, especially in the West, for all those years, for very good at the time, a lot of money put into industry, very comfortable situation, and now we start complaining. And one of the solutions, but probably one of the groups that we could, well, the reasons of our problems, that actually could be a state that being the one the journalists became over-dependent. And this would be Mr. Jan Philip, the tender question, who actually represents the European Broadcasting Union, which is actually representing state broadcasters who are much more affluent than private media. They provide for journalists much better than private media, and that's a question about those spoilers.
Well, I don't think I present state broadcasters. I represent public broadcasters, which is a big difference. And I think that when you talk solutions, we need to talk about sustainable solutions. And I do think that public service media is by far today the best model to guarantee independent journalism, because that's what is at stake. If we wanted a democracy to function properly, then you need independent journalism. But public broadcasting doesn't happen like this. You need some conditions to be fulfilled for public service media to function properly. And I would like to mention 4. The first one is you need a good, independent and properly functioning regulatory body, which guarantees that in the judiciary framework, you operate at arm's length from the institution, the broadcaster, towards the political bodies. The second important thing is that you need editorial independence, and which means that you need to have a codex, ethical standards, journalistic standards, which define how you operate journalism. And they have to be at arm's length, again, from your direct management, to ensure that you keep quality journalism, independent journalism. The third problem is that you need sustainable funding. You can have a good framework, but if you don't have the money to operate good journalism or to operate good media, then you have a problem. And the fourth point, I think, is that you need to have a flexible remit, because we have been discussing a lot about the gathering of news, the production of news, I would say. But today we have to spread or to distribute news on various platforms, not only on the traditional media, but on these media as well. And I would say if you tick off these 4 boxes, then you are guaranteed to get good public service media. But for sure it can be under threat when we hear the stories of Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and so on. You don't have a proper regulatory body which divides politics from public service media. You don't have the right editorial independent standards to function within. So that's one big threat. My other big fear is a new trend that is popping up, that in Western democracies, financial sustainability is under pressure. We mentioned Switzerland before, where we are going to have a vote or a referendum beginning of March, where the public has to answer the question, are you willing to pay for public service media? Which is like a question, are you willing to pay taxes? The answer is no. So you have to make the case for public service media in a country like Switzerland. The same happens in Denmark, where the government is proposing a 25% budget cut from the public broadcaster, which means that the remit within which they want to function and can function properly is under pressure. So for me, I don't think we have been spoiled. We need public service media. You don't have public service media in the United States. The idea doesn't exist there. And then it's difficult to say that you have really independent media in the United States as well, because either you have the audience and the public that goes for Fox, that is right-thinking and is supporting Trump, and then you have the other 49 or 51% that goes for CNN, that is thinking on the other side. So I'm creating a model where you have media pluralism, where this public service media is putting pressure on commercial media to provide good journalism is one of the conditions that needs to be fulfilled. And for sure, you mentioned algorithms as well. In order for us to distribute the news, we are more and more dependent on social media. But we have no say whatsoever, not on a national level. Europe is trying to put some pressure on these social media. But they don't want to be involved in the content business. The announcement they have done recently to promote news that comes from friends and families over other reports is not good either, because if we can define what is quality journalism and we push quality journalism through media literacy, news literacy, and pushing this sort of content through the algorithm, then we can guarantee and provide an international framework that guarantees good journalism. And I'm not pessimistic, I'm optimistic by nature, but there's work to be done. And it's very important we have a conference like this, we have international bodies, who raise the question, who address the problem. But I think that it's very important that we make the audience aware as well of how important it is for them to get independent journalism and give them a choice. It's not about pushing one media, but it's making them aware that they need to get out of their filter bubble, whatever filter bubble it is, and get more independent resources which they can check and rely upon.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this algorithm, I'm not saying it's not an issue. It's also an issue in Poland. Some conservative groups were complaining that just because of the 1 or 2 words, they were pushed out of the sites just because they were in some algorithm niche. But the question is very interesting, like you were saying that paying for your public media is like paying taxes. It's necessary for democracy. Well, let's put it on the other way. What's necessary for democracy, it's a free market. And when state becomes the one who competes with a private entrepreneurship, with the private entities, private media, isn't it a danger also for democracy? And I'll ask the question for Wout van Wyk, who is Director of News Media Europe. It represents actually private publishers.
Yes, that's right. First of all, thanks very much for having me on this panel. My name is Wout van Wijk. I'm the Executive Director of News Media Europe. We're basically a lobby in Brussels, a trade association. I represent over 2,200 titles of print, radio, TV, and online news brands. And so while we follow the Brussels movements and the legislative debates that affect the news media industry, and some of that we meet the EFJ on frequently. The positions that we take and the way we aim to look at sort of what we push for is to ensure media pluralism and media freedom in Europe. Those are our underpinning beliefs. You mentioned when you started speaking sustainability, and I think sustainability is key to or part of this debate. I represent privately owned media. I must say also my membership consists mainly of Western and Nordic media. The role that we play is therefore slightly also different than the role that the public service broadcasters have. It's good to acknowledge that. I also think that there is definitely an important role for public service broadcasters in society. The risk that we see often is, and it's by no means sort of a direct attack what I'm about to do here, but we fear sort of crowding out of the privately owned media by public service broadcasters by sort of overstepping a merit that they have. I think back to sustainability, the role of the platforms on which we've grown dependent in a way to get our content out there, and in a way, I mean, the examples that you mentioned in your intervention, I think, show that there's a lot of good coming from sort of an open internet whereby people can communicate and share through social media platforms. The issue that we see with social media platforms is that a lot of the investments of publishers sort of disappear into the deep pockets of Silicon Valley in that sense. Unfortunately, the return that publishers see from sort of the investments that they make in journalism on the platforms is very limited. And so part of what we are trying to do in Brussels, and we see, fortunately, that the European Union has sort of woken up to this fact that there is a relative imbalance between those sort of two industries that actually also inherently need each other, is to sort of trying to reinstate that balance. Sustainability is key. The money needs to come back into making sure that publishers can continue to invest in quality and independent journalism.
Yeah, and that's always will be a question if we'll start paying taxes for public media, are we going to pay for private as well? Because this how much you can spend. Galina, the question you said, you also try to shine some light into what is happening. And can you tell us what drives people really to do to trying to produce independent media, how they are able to survive and support themselves? What is what constitutes their independence? How they are able to sustain themselves?
Oh, it's a very difficult question because not every media wants to disclose their sources of funding, but the rather new trend is that independent media is trying to introduce the prescriptions to sell actually information, to open some additional publications for readers only if they pay for content. And I have to admit that it's not popular, even among audience which supports independent journalism and really is hunger for independent news. But still, the price is quite high, so general public cannot, in many cases, cannot allow themselves to pay that much. Like, for instance, the yearly prescription for Dozhd online TV station is about like €90, and for a general citizen, it's quite a high price. So they would rather read a little bit which is available without paying, rather than pay that for opening the whole website. But still, I think it's a way to make independent media more sustainable financially. And another issue that they can try to produce some other content which can bring them some income, but then to use this income to actually fund independent journalism and support independent opinions and pluralism in media. But still, financial part of existence of independent media in Russia is a big, big problem. Because, as you rightly said, state is a big actor in this field, and state invests a lot of money in media. It actually buys media. It not just owns media, which is already state registered, state funded, but also buys independent media by providing them, offering them funding contracts, and media which competes for funding for income coming from advertisement. They really hunger for, they don't have enough money coming from advertisement market because it's not a rubber market, and it's a lot of media available on the market, and it's not enough of money for them, for all of them to be independent and support themselves just by selling their availabilities. So what's the outcome out of this? State understands that it's easy to provide a possibility to give them some state money out of the regional budgets, let's say, and media, and even independent media, compete for this money because that helps them to support themselves. But that also limits their freedom to criticize the government because they have like a lot of money coming from the local budget, and they cannot criticize the one who is actually paying for information to be published. So that's kind of like a tricky game which is going on, and state is quite successful in this. Independent media, to survive, has to get this money, sacrificing their independence.
You want to add something to that?
Well, I just wanted to comment on something you said about the sort of subscription fees and so on. I mean, part of the problem, and I know you've asked us to talk about solutions, but I just wanted to illustrate the fact that when the internet emerged, basically, we got to know the internet as a medium on which we could find content for free, right? And so the culture, if you will, online is one of everything for free. This is slightly changing now with services like Netflix and Spotify becoming more prevalent, and people are actually getting used to pay subscriptions for content online. This is a sort of a cultural change that still needs to happen to some extent. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the internet, an internet where everything is for free doesn't exist, basically. You pay in different ways, maybe not with money, but with data. And we should get a free internet, yes, but we should get rid of the notion that everything on the internet should be for free.
Okay, would you like to add to it? Obviously, we have to add one thing. We are talking about little two different worlds of the problems. When we talk about sustainability, also it's different. It's something different in Russia or Serbia or in case of the West, which is the more financial problem than freedom of journalists. It's more of the support their freedom rather than rights of the journalists. We have to remember that. Please.
But I think it's important that good journalism comes at a cost. And it's important we are very transparent about how journalism is being funded. It can be the commercial model, it can be the public service media model, but we need to be transparent about how it is funded, and journalism is totally different than propaganda. Propaganda also comes at a cost, but that is not journalism. And if you look at public service media, the average cost of public service media in Europe today is €60 per person. If you compare to us paying now €10 per month for Spotify, €10 per month for Netflix, you pay 30 to 40 euro per month to have these subscriptions. Whereas in public service media, which comes at a considerable low cost of €60, which gives you independent news and very good content, it's important. And I agree, it's not about an either-or model. You know, I think you need competition to have good journalism, but be transparent about how it is funded, how it is governed to guarantee this independence.
Gulnara, tell us a little about support for this media now. How you support those independent, those striving for some money, who won't let themselves to be bought by government or corrupted money. How you try to think about supporting them?
You mean how we support independent media in countries like Russia or Azerbaijan or Turkey, where press freedom is under attack? We believe that it's only a holistic approach that solves the problem. And it's so important to build solidarity, and solidarity was mentioned earlier today by our Turkish colleague. She said that solidarity is so much required, and I do agree, because every single media stakeholder in Turkey would ask for solidarity first. So it's a combination of solidarity, it's a combination of capacity development, training, sharing the knowledge, networking, but it's also, I have to say, it's also material support. That is important, because we cannot compare media in Russia with media in Belgium, for example. These models, that business models that work perfectly in free countries, they do not work in countries which are not free. And we should always remember that. And if we just, turn our blind eye to what's going on in those countries and say, oh, it's so dangerous, it's so risky, we don't want to support them, we don't want to bring any harm, then there would be complete information vacuum in countries like Russia, etc. I just want to bring you one example. We talk a lot about Russian propaganda, but what have we done as media development community to address Russian propaganda, except for exposing fake news? We should invest in good journalism in Russia, and there are media in Russia who continue working against the odds, who continue providing news and objective information to the general public in Russia. There is even a network of investigative journalists in Russia who change things at the local level, and we work with them. They are super great. And it's really very important for us to come to understand that we should stand in solidarity and we should provide support, networking, capacity development activity, but it's also material support. Just one example, and then I will shut up. We look at the propaganda, Russian propaganda. There is a very famous video, and Galina would know that, a propagandist video in Russia called Российский оккупант, the Russian occupant. And that's about promotion of war, about promotion of Russian global ambition. And that video costs around 1 million rubles, Russian rubles, production of that video. There are also great, fantastic information video spots produced by Medusa, it's animation, and it costs 400, but you cannot compare 40,000 rubles. 40,000 rubles and 1 million rubles. So the state has the money and they invest in propaganda machine. And if we want to create balance, to provide diversity of opinion, to provide Russian people with reliable information, then we should support independent media by solidarity actions, by capacity development, but also by material support.
In Galina's presentation, we hear how a lot of those things are done through the legal procedures, how state step by step is limiting the free media. And it's actually, they are not, except the cases where journalists are attacked, but quite often it's just done in the face of law. And now in the West, we have a lot of discussions about some new regulations. For example, the issue of a hate speech regulation. And it's quite also controversial into how far it shall go and into what extent it should interfere in journalist work and publication, what's a hate, what's just an opinion. Do you have, could you dwell a little on the subject, please?
Well, I think we need to operate on two levels. For sure, there needs to be regulation, because regulation is how a democracy works. And the social media platforms have given such a big exposure and such a big possibility for individuals on the one hand to express themselves in whatever way they want. So it needs to be regulated. But I think that we need to educate the audience as well. I think it's very important that we invest more money in media literacy and in news literacy, because I see that the audience swallows whatever it gets. And the good thing about social media platforms is that it gives a possibility to give alternate ways to individuals, to journalists, to express themselves. So on the one hand, I think it's operating on a regulatory basis, setting the right frameworks. But on the other hand, and for me it's as important, it's about educating the audience in knowing what sources they have, having a broader view, go for media pluralism, read other articles than the ones you usually get.
And isn't it also a danger of this kind of liberal democracy censorship, delicate censorship, going into what journalists, either we talk about hate crime or we talk fake news, it's a wide range of interpretation and it's some danger. Should it really be strictly regulated?
Well, I think this is why it's so important what Jean-Philippe meant. We should, in my view, give consumers of news content the right tools and the right knowledge to deal with it themselves. Not that sort of the sole responsibility should lie with them, that's not what I mean, but we should indeed invest in getting sort of a critical readership, teach people how to decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong in this sense. Of course, there are a lot of media or news literacy programs around. Personally, I'd like to see, for instance, a European Union action which sort of brings media literacy into the school curricula throughout Europe. Not only limited, by the way, to schools and to young people, because especially given the fact that news consumption is changing, I think it's very important to sort of bring up to date the knowledge and the ways that well, not only youngsters but basically anyone has the right tools to deal with this. And on top of that, I think that another important element could be to bring more training, and you mentioned it, more training, more tools, new technologies into sort of the newsrooms, not only for journalists, but basically anyone who deals with the production of news content.
Thank you so much. In a second, I'd like to talk about investigative journalism, and there was a lot of said here today in this room, but maybe we could go deeper into it. But are there any questions? I would love to. Yes. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I had questions to Galina, but they were about Russia, so maybe we'll do that later. And I want to stay within this, financial sustainability issue. So this is a question to all of you. Earlier in the panel, we discussed actually own their newspapers, for example. I think Taz is in Germany is a good example, because I don't think in Turkey we have that culture, but is it possible for readers to support their own reading? Maybe not for Dojd, but for print magazines.
There are some media, even in Poland, that they're collecting money directly from readers as donations, and I don't know how is it in Russia or other countries that is popular.
I think you have some very good examples. I think The Correspondent in Netherlands is a very good example where people actually, there's crowdfunding and they pay for their articles. But in some way, the New York Times is crowdfunding as well. It's a subscription model where you say, I trust this source and I'm willing to pay, what is it, $20 a month to get this sort of news. But before you can go to crowdfunding and have people actually pay money to do for it, they need to be aware, they consider The Correspondent or the New York Times to be a trusted source. That's why they're willing to pay for it. And again, for me, then it's about education. I think if people want quality, they might be willing to pay for it.
And the New York Times once did an experiment, kind of bidding. I mean, when people were buying selective articles for sale or commentaries, when people were buying, they were raising the price, and they were trying to see what's the highest level they can get.
Well, there's another model like The Guardian in the UK who gives the articles for free, but then when you've read one or two articles, they say, well, you might be willing to contribute to continue reading this sort of articles you appreciate.
Galina?
I would say that Russia probably is not the best example when it comes to charity and donations and supporting general, and people don't understand why they have to pay for this. And when it comes to Russian people, Russian society, they are ready to donate only if it's a question of building a new church or supporting homeless animals or gather some money to heal a sick child. That's three issues that might touch the heart of Russian citizens. Freedom of expression, independent media is not an issue. Therefore, it's even difficult from people who understand the values to prescribe, to pay for independent, to support independent media. I'm not talking about the general public. Crowdfunding is not working when it comes to the work of NGOs, when it comes to the work of independent media, and it needs a lot of time and efforts to change this culture, to grow this culture.
Okay. Another question?
Yes,
sir.
My name is Per Trehörning. I'm from Sweden, and by the way, we had discussion in Sweden how to change the finance of public service from a compulsory fee, about 19 euro per month, to taxes. But my question to the panel is, your opinion of press subsidies, that the state pays money for papers that will guarantee that is only one paper on one location. What is your opinion about that?
Anyone on the topic?
Again, it's about the sustainability, I think. It's about guaranteeing that you have a framework in which good, independent journalism can work. Some go for the license model where you pay directly as an individual. In some other cases, the state guarantees that you get a funding. But for me, the good operating model is, and let me take the BBC as an example. The BBC is funded by the government, but there is a charter, and the charter stipulates what is expected of the BBC. And it's very transparent. It's a contract that says this is how we expect the BBC to evolve, to have, to guarantee good content and good journalism. And then there is Ofcom, the regulatory body, in between the BBC and in between the funding, that keeps these sort of things independent. EBU is in favor of the license model because that is a direct funding from the audience, your key stakeholder. I come from Belgium, where it is provided for by the government. If you have a government who is not supportive of independent journalism, as is the case in some territories, then I would say this is not the right model. So you have to look at it from case to case. It's not only about supporting public service media. The case, again, of Switzerland, there will be no local regional journalism anymore. If the referendum is approved, it's no public service media, but you won't have in the French territory in Switzerland and in the Italian territory in Switzerland, you basically have no local journalism anymore. So, and that's where I think it's I said before, it's not about either or, it's not about private or public. But it's about guaranteeing this framework. And for me, from the EBE point of view, it is public service media that can guarantee the independence of good commercial media and local journalism. My biggest fear overall as well is that we need to protect local journalism. It is not bad to think about local identity in a positive way, because today all of the funding through the platforms is going to happen on a global way. To give the example of Netflix, they always say Netflix is investing 8 billion in content. Netflix is investing 0 in content. They're investing 8 billion in marketing so that people will subscribe to the Netflix model. And the day that they have finished, they have had all the potential subscription, then they will reduce the cost and say, well, 8 billion is a bit expensive for content, so we'll reduce the content. And it's only local media that can guarantee this independence and can guarantee a local identity in a positive way.
Just on subsidies, I think if you look at the EU, most member states, a couple don't, but have indirect subsidies. That is to say, a lower VAT rate, for instance, on for what is now printed press. As an illustration on perhaps how far behind some legislation is on sort of the new reality within the industry, is that we are now discussing allowing governments to to apply the same VAT rate as they would do for printed press to the same content online. And so, I mean, when we're talking about, again, sustainability of the industry, for me, this is sort of it's a no-brainer, basically. Unfortunately, well, I'll spare you the political process, but that process is stuck now in council. Yeah.
Well, I know I'm not supposed to comment, but it's something I really would like to. Is just there's always a danger when you subsidize any industry, especially media, that you stop their reforming and adjusting to the reality of the new market. It's like an American Amtrak. There was one discussion whether they should turn instead of the railroad to the airplanes. Well, then government came in and they subsidized the railroads, and that's completely degenerated industry. So it's always a danger that if you won't let the media compete with each other and let the weak ones die, the stronger one will never appear. And in case of Switzerland, I think this is just if you create a vacuum and possibility, the money would come. But as long as people believe the state would someday will come and help, they'll never try to compete with the state. Anybody? Yes, please.
So I'm really glad, Jean-Philippe, that you mentioned, sorry, I'm Jodie Ginsberg from Index on Censorship, local journalism. We've just come back from a press freedom trip, ironically, to the United States, where actually the likes of the Washington Post and the New York Times are in relatively good health, but local journalism has been totally eviscerated. And I admire your faith that the market will fill the vacuum that will be created, but that has not happened in the United States, and local journalism has been killed off, and that's a vital plank for all of the journalism that you've talked about, the quality journalism that follows. And so the first question I wanted to ask the panel is how we can best support local journalism. The second is, our colleague from Hungary earlier talked about asymmetric warfare, and I think a number of the panelists have also described that essentially. In those countries where the state invests heavily either in propaganda or indeed both in propaganda, but also, in fact, co-opting independent media by making them subservient to advertising, how can those from outside those countries best support independent media inside, particularly when we're seeing the likes of Russia and elsewhere clamp down very heavily on foreign investment? The traditional funders of independent media, the likes of OSF and so on, are being branded as enemies of the state and actively prevented from investing. So in that case, and given the challenges we've discussed already about the commercial models, where is that funding source for the kinds of independent media that you all agree, I think, need to be invested in?
Anybody? Well,
honestly, I don't have an answer. I have no idea where money would come from to support independent media and those who support this independent media within the country. When it comes to Russia, all independent sources have been thrown out of the country, particularly American sources, as you mentioned, Soros Foundation and other American foundations are not able to operate in Russia. So NGOs and media, they have lost those sources of support because state believes it's some kind of influence on internal Russian policy. But still, it's a question of probably trying to educate people, and media literacy is, I agree, it's one of the task and one of the aim, but it's a long-term project because we need to raise a few generations of people who would not tolerate propaganda, who would be willing to support, who would be willing to subscribe for independent media, and they would see the difference. But now the problem is that Russian audience doesn't see the difference between propaganda, fake news, and independent information. So they don't value independent and good quality journalism. So it's a long way. Maybe it would not. Maybe it can work in other countries, but I'm not a pessimistic person, but I still don't see the way out of this right now in my country, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. Maybe we'll just try to entertain two more questions. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to thank you very much for your question, Josie, and it's so good that you mentioned again information wars, because these are what is happening. And there is this new terminology, hybrid threat, when we also talk about cyber threat, where we have misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and fake news used as a military weapon. And it's not only about Russian citizens, it's also beyond Russia, because Russian propaganda, it affects everyday life of people in Denmark, in Sweden, in France, in the United States. We've recently hosted roundtable in Copenhagen where we invited Luda Savchuk. She's a Russian whistleblower who planted herself into the famous Trolls factory owned by Russian oligarch close to Putin, President Putin. And she just told the story how people were working in these trolls, working in that troll factory, and how they had different departments. They would have a department called International Relations Department, where they were responsible for misinformation, disinformation activities in France. And this is happening, and the answer is media literacy. Not only media literacy inside Russia, but also it's a training for us, for all of us, how to expose propaganda and fake news, how to make a difference between good journalism and misinformation. It's a new threat, which is called hybrid threat, and we cannot just ignore that.
In Poland, we have, I think, of 2 networks I can think of that are trying to expose mainly, most of them Russian trolls, and they're doing it a very good job. There was a question here, gentleman in the white.
Thank you. My name is Lars Werge. I'm president of the Danish Union of Journalists. Thank you, Ms. Arapova, for an interesting lecture. I would like to hear the other panelists' view, because there seems for me to be 2 ways of pressure from state control, state pressure towards free media. And as I hear it, you mostly concentrate on the funding and the economic side. Ms. Arapova very clearly described the state control, the state pressure that leads to self-censorship regarding the laws. We also heard discussions earlier today about this law in the different countries. We hear how the pressure on the journalists and pressure on the media houses. What can the media houses do to protect the journalism, the free journalism, the independent journalism in this way? I mean, protection of sources, protection of journalists, and so.
You mean publishers or media houses? You mean by publishers? What publishers?
We have EBU and the publisher organization, and that's also their responsibility to be a wall towards the politicians and the governments.
In different countries as well.
Pardon?
Yeah. In different countries also. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I reckon.
No, I mean I couldn't agree more, and I think that if I were to speak for my industry, that realization is definitely there. What for us, I mean, I'll describe it perhaps as a problem, but like for us, the money needs to keep coming in basically to be able to pay for these efforts and for the resources in order to indeed protect journalists, to make sure that there's lawyers who can help them out and so on. And this is, I mean, the answer is probably not going to satisfy you, but in the end, I mean, the way I look at it, it is indeed an economic pressure that we need to deal with. If I were to be able to sort of put the solution on the table, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. But I see solutions in trying to sort of creating a regulatory environment whereby investments flow back to those who made the investments in the first place. I hope that will at least give you some sort of answer. Sorry.
So it always comes back to money.
I think there are 2 ways of lobbying. There's public lobbying, there's the Brussels office, there's the legal and regulatory framework. We do a lot of lobbying in silence as well. We have some problems in our backyards, which we want to address. The easiest way would say, well, we have problems in our backyards and we dismiss them and they are outside of the membership, which would not be a long-term solution. So we go and talk with governments about their interpretation of public service media. We oppose against state broadcasting. So that's the lobby work that is going on. And we also do what we call peer-to-peer reviews. Public service media is not about return on investment, it's about the return to society. Ultimately, what do you give back to society? So that's why we operate in a framework of values, independence, universality, accountability, and so on. And we do peer-to-peer reviews where public service media visits other public service media, produce a report where we are a critical friend, and publish these reports publicly as well. We did it in Romania, for instance, recently. They have some problems there as well, but it helped them, you know, to move forward in making the problem public.
Thank you.
Just to add to it, maybe indeed, because before I took this role, and I used to work for the technology industry, and what surprised me when I came into this industry is the willingness of what would be competitors to sort of share best practices, to go actually abroad and discuss and address some of the issues locally. And so I think indeed if fostering sort of and keeping this environment whereby best practices are exchanged, hopefully is very useful.
Okay. Okay, one more sentence.
As far as impunity for violence against journalists is concerned, I understand the question was what can be done to address, for example, impunity and attacks against journalists, which was part of Galina's presentation, and it's a murder of journalists is a form of censorship. What can be done to address this? So my answer would be that from my personal experience, and I have been advocating for a score of journalists and writers, bloggers imprisoned or harassed by different governments, I would say that ongoing, sustained international pressure based on facts and statistics that come from the countries, it works. We've seen that, for example, in Azerbaijan, where a number of political prisoners have been released following huge international pressure. And that was not only international human rights organizations, not only governments, but it was civil society from all over the world, from former Soviet Union countries, also a lot human rights organizations from Russia stood up for their colleagues in Azerbaijan. So it works when there is a sustained ongoing pressure. And sometimes we have to think outside the box. If, for example, Council of Europe cannot hold Azerbaijan accountable for not implementing decision of the European Court, it is time to go and talk to EIB, for example, European Investment Bank. It's time to go and talk to EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, because Azerbaijan is dependent from those European banks, and they look up the ratings, the resolutions by the Council of Europe. So this type of advocacy and lobbying should also be considered when it comes to countries with repressive regime.
Okay. Okay, one last question. We can't hear you, I'm sorry.
I hope it's working now. Yeah, great. I'm hearing myself now. I'm very grateful, actually, to everybody here for a good information. I'm not a journalist, but we had some baseless accusations regarding Azerbaijan, as usual. Regarding the case of Ilgar Mammadov, actually, he refuses being released from prison, saying that he refuses to wear a bracelet. It's a first case. And the other case, it was about some journalist or some human rights activists being detained in Azerbaijan. None of them have been detained because of their professional activity. Some of them were accused of because of tax evasion, money laundering, or smuggling. As I said, I'm not just a journalist. We today listened a lot to journalists. I didn't say anything, but in the last, my comments from my embassy, from my perspective. Thanks a lot.
Okay, just rebound, but this will be the last one. Please.
Actually, when I came here, the idea was that I will present the case of Mehman Huseynov, who is a very talented youngster and Azerbaijan's most popular anti-corruption blogger, who is right now languishing behind bars on bogus defamation charges. The charges that have been brought against him is defamation charges. And why these charges came? The charges stem from him speaking publicly about torture he was subjected to while in police custody in Azerbaijan. And the reason why he was ill-treated and harassed is because he published a series of video investigative reports exposing alleged government corruption.
Thank you so much. Well,
can I just add something?
Thank you.
Okay. Just 2 words. Just to answer our Azerbaijan colleague, it's same message that Russian gongos are sending to the audience, that all of those human rights activists and journalists who are being jailed, they're jailed for good because they either did break the law on torture or something else, or tax, or they committed a crime. Look how bad they are. Government uses this tricky, and we all understand that, it's a tricky way to undermine the reputation of journalists, to bring charges based on something not linked to profession. If you look at those cases, and we take a lot of those cases to the court and to the European Court of Human Rights as well, it's a very easy and clear to smart public way to silence free journalism and free speech. And Russia and Azerbaijan is using that a lot. And believe me, human rights lawyers, as I am one, will find the way to deal with that, because you will not be able to trick the public forever and to bring those charges against free and independent journalists just to silence them and showing them, exposing them to the public, saying that they're just pure criminals. It should not work in normal society anymore.
Thank you so much. It reminds me of martial law in Poland, where I was a student at that time, and we were arrested for littering mainly, not for distributing newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you, fantastic panelists. Thank you, and sorry for prolonged panel.